This video is brought to you by SailRite. Visit SailRite.com for all your project supplies, tools, and instructions. In this tutorial video, we're going to be showing you how to make a comforter for an RV. If you'd like your comforter fabric to match or complement other fabrics in your RV, you may want to make your own comforter. Follow this tutorial video and we'll show you how it's done. This video is part of our Airstream Argosy renovation. We'll be renovating an Airstream from top to bottom, inside and out. Join us for this exciting video series. This is a look before the bedroom of the RV was complete, and this is a look after we're done. This tutorial video will concentrate on making the comforter as we discussed. Let's get started. Some RVs have odd size mattresses. Because of that, we're going to measure it and determine the finished size of our comforter. So I'm going to measure the mattress for our comforter here. And I'm going to measure all the way at the head, and then I'm going to come down to the foot and determine how far down I want it to come. So this is my finished measurement. So I'm going to make the comforter come down here and be a finished size of about 89 inches. You can have it come down further if you'd like, but for me, I think 89 inches is about perfect. So that is the length. Now let's get the width. For the width, we've determined that we want it to hang down about 15 inches on each side. Most comforters have a lining fabric on the bottom side, a polyester batting in the center, and then the decorative fabric on top. Here's a look ahead at the batting underneath, the lining on top, and then the decorative fabric placed over it. Right now we want to concentrate on the batting. So we have the two layers of the 0.3 batting on top of each other with these sides matched up. We're going to sew approximately a 1/4 inch from the raw edge with a straight stitch. Just to keep everything together, we're going to attach some wonder clips. That way I don't have to worry about keeping the edges lined up as I sew. So I have a very light home sewing machine thread in here. You don't need anything heavy. And we're going to sew with this edge right against the inside of the presser foot. And I'm doing a 6mm stitch length. No reason to do anything short to shrink up the batting. Once I get to a wonder clip, I just move it out of the way. We're using the SailRite UltraFeed LSC sewing machine set up in the industrial sewing table with a workhorse servo motor. Okay, so it's sewing here, and when you splay it out, you may be saying, hey, that's going to have a big bump. But it really is hardly noticeable. And now we have batting that's wide enough for our application, so that's perfect. Now that our batting width is added to, we need to do the same thing to the lining fabric. Here again, we're going to use our wonder clips with the edges lined up so they don't move while we sew, and we'll place them everywhere between 8 to 12 inches apart down the length of our fabric. I've set my stitch length to about 3.5 to 3 millimeters, and my reverse as well. We're going to sew in straight stitch, and I always want to test with the light fabric. This is a drapery lining fabric, and I'm using a very light thread and a very small needle. I believe this is a 14. And we want to make sure that we get very little puckering. If we do, we need to back off the upper tension. So we look at the fabric to see if there's much puckering, and it doesn't look like there is much, and our stitch looks good on the top and the bottom. If it were puckering, like at the beginning here, which I didn't show, you can see there's puckering here. The stitch looks good, but way too much puckering. And what I did is I turned this knob counterclockwise about a full revolution, but I like where it's at right now. Let me test it one more time. Yes, that looks great. Now we're ready to sew. So I'm going to sew this stitch about a 1/2 inch from the raw edge of the fabric, and there's really no reason to do any reversing at the beginning. I'm going to use the 1/2 inch mark on the needle plate. And as I get to the wonder clips, I'll remove them. Unfortunately, we have to add to the width of the decorative fabric, but it's a little bit more complicated because it has a pattern. We're going to show you how to deal with that. For us, our desired finish size is 80 inches in width by 89 inches in length. We need to consider the seam allowance that's required. We will be sewing the 3 layers of fabric together, the lining, the batting, and the decorative fabric, so we'll be using a 1/2 inch seam allowance around the perimeter. That's the line in blue. The width of our fabric is 54 inches. That's not wide enough for our desired finish size, so we need to add panels. So a second panel can be added to make the desired width, adding a seam in the center. But we don't think that looks as good for a comforter. We would rather have a seam to the left and to the right. So now we have the calculations to determine the cut size for the length and the width of our comforter. The rectangle shown in red is the cut size of our comforter. The fabric is not wide enough along the width to fill the red rectangle, so a second panel of fabric will have to be added to the first to gain the 83-inch width. If you're okay with the seam being in the center, you can simply cut away the extra on the 2 sides. However, we don't like the seam on a comforter to be in the center, but rather we think it looks best when 2 seams are added, and one is to the left and the other to the right, balancing the seams, both left and right, of the bed. It's easy to calculate the amount of decorative fabric required depending on the size of your comforter. Pause here to study our math. Now we need to join these panels together, and to do that we need to match the pattern.
Pattern matching for a fabric like this is actually quite difficult because of the patterns that we have in this fabric. So I can't just match up the ends of the fabric and sew it together. I have to look at the pattern, and I have to find a pattern that's consistent. So if I use this one, the pink and white, I think what I need to do is match it up to this one here. Let's see if that works. So I'm going to scoot this down. Now they're directly across from each other, but these are not, so which means I need to go a little bit more. So now I have pink and white, I have white and blue, and then I have this looks the same, this looks the same. Now this is matched up. So I'm wasting this much fabric, which is what? Almost not quite 2 foot. It's probably like 20 some inches of fabric. So you need to order extra fabric if you plan to do pattern matching. So I'm going to take this fabric and turn it so right sides are facing each other. And we'll get this all organized and then show you exactly what we're doing. Usually the manufacturer gives you enough fabric that you can go in about a 1/2 inch or 1 inch from the edge. But if you look at this little pattern here that is supposed to line up with that one, see the holes from the manufacturer in that? That means you'll see those holes on the selvage edge, which would not be good, which means we can't actually sew it very close to the selvage edge. We have to find the next usable pattern, and that's actually all the way into here. So we're going to waste about 6.5 inches here and about 6.5 inches here, just because the manufacturer didn't really get these patterns correct. So I've lined it up top to bottom with the pattern. So here is where we're going to match it up. This edge here will go along the edge of this one here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to strike a line on this because it's hard to determine what's straight. So if I take a straight edge and I place it on that white square, and then on this white square here, these are all supposed to be even. This square, this one, and this one. But it's an upholstery fabric, so you have to remember that the upholstery fabrics don't stay true when you're marking them. So see if I do this with the fabric, see how that moves the fabric around till I get it straight on my straight edge. Now all these fabrics are in line, and I'm not going to place a line directly on that white square. I'm going to come over about a 1/16 to an 1/8 inch from that line, or from that square right there, and I'm going to mark a line here. Now I'm going to use this chalk pencil, and I'm going to mark this line. This is going to be my straight line on this pattern. right there. Now we're going to move the fabric and we're going to continue to mark this line, making sure it's straight. Now the reason that I'm putting a line on this, because I don't usually do that if I have a pattern that's pretty easy to tell where it's supposed to go, but the pattern is so spaced so far apart, it's hard to know exactly where I'm supposed to put this. So this line is just a helpful reference to keep everything nice and straight. If I had a fabric with a lot of pattern, I wouldn't necessarily need the line. Now I could put a line on this one. This one's folded back and I can see where it's supposed to be creased. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually fold it nicely here from pattern to pattern. And then I'm going to use a iron on low heat and crease the fabric here. And then we can just lay this crease on the line that we struck earlier. So I'm going to do this down the whole length, right where that pattern should be over top of this pattern. So now we're going to take our crease and we're going to lay it on top of that line that we struck. Now we're going to be sewing really close to this edge here. So we want this to extend a little bit past that so that we're actually sewing right here. And so it's basically a 1/16 inch over from that pattern a little bit, so which is basically right on top of that line. Then I'm going to take my magic forked pin, and I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go this way, and I'm going to go into the fabric and then come out of the fabric here and then go in. So I've got it pinned right where I want it. The neat thing about these pins, if you look here, they're easy to come back out of the fabric, so I really like them. And then I'm going to match up the next pattern, which is over here. This one's pretty close, but this one's easier to match up. So we're right there, I'm a little bit over, and I'm directly on top of that, and I'm going to pin it here, and come through, and then go into the fabric there. And I'm going to put some pins here too, because I want to make sure that this doesn't move as I sew. So in and out, and then in again, like that. And I will continue to do this down the line. And I'm also going to pin this direction. So I'm actually going to come down here in between some pins, because I don't want it to shift in this direction either, like that. Put one here too. We just don't want this to move as we take it to the sewing machine and sew, because we want our fabric to be lined up perfectly. And I'll keep matching this up. So watch here. This one needs to come down a little bit to be matched up, and pull it over the top by about a 1/16 of an inch. And then I'll pin this here. Everything is pinned. We have the pins going all in the same direction, so I can sew this way, because this is a sharp end. I wouldn't want to sew that way. I want to sew this way, and everything should be smooth when we take it to the sewing machine and sew.
Now we'll sew those decorative fabric panels together using the Sayrite Ultrafeed sewing machine.
Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to sew very close to this edge, as close as possible without sewing off of it. I'm going to sew at about a 3mm stitch length, straight stitch. I'm going to move my needle to the right position. Okay, make sure everything stays pinned well. Keep your eye on that. And sew really close to that fold. I've already checked my stitch tension with some scrap. See what it looks like. So you can see the stitch.
already put that.
Okay. So when you take it apart, that's what you should get. And then you can, if you have any white chalk on this, you can take it off with a wet rag pretty easily. Not bad. So I'm using the clear acrylic ruler and marking it with chalk so I can cut a 1/2 inch from our seam on both sides. This doesn't have to be accurate, but I like to do this. And then what I'll do is I'll take my scissors, making sure that I don't cut my top piece, and cut these tails off. So they have about a 1/2 inch left over on each side. Here's the seam that we just made. This is the outside surface of the fabric. And what I'm doing is I'm measuring. This is the center panel. We're going to add a piece to the right side and the left side. So what I'm doing is I'm measuring from that seam right on these patterns. So this little square there is represented with the seam falling right here. So that's measuring from that seam to that location, which is the exact same spot where this was sewn. That is 42 inches. Now our overall panel before sewing, the cut width needs to be 82 inches. So 82 is our desired cut size, minus 42 leaves us with 40 inches. 40 inches divided by 2, because we have one piece on the right side and one piece on the left side, is 20 inches, which means we need to cut the excess on this, the right side, to 20 inches from our seam. So we're going to move the fabric over so we can do that.
Notice that I mistakenly had 82 inches as our cut size. It needed to be 83, but it'll still work out in the end.
20 inches from this seam puts us right here. But I'm going to go to this pattern here because that makes it easier for me to determine what's straight. So I'm off by a what is that, 1/8 of an inch, who cares? So here is where we're going to cut, and what I'll do is I'll strike a line with my chalk at that location all the way down the length of our fabric. So we're going to cut down this line, and we're going to try to be a little bit careful because this is going to be the finished edge, though we are going to sew the batting and the lining to it, but we still want it to be nice and straight. This is a strip we just cut off the other side, and I'm laying it face down on top of the left side now. And I actually lined it up already a little bit, but you can see our patterns are lining up here and here. And I folded this over, because this would basically be like this, but I'm folding it over so I can match up the patterns again. So we have the pattern lined up. This is our mark that we made for the center panel. The center panel's on the underside. This is the left-hand side panel that we just moved over. So our patterns are lined up, and all we need to do is strike a line on this, and then we'll fold this over so the patterns match up, and we'll iron this edge, we'll pin it in place, and we'll take it to the sewing machine and sew it just like we did before. So we've got this side on, and we measure from the seam 20 inches, just like the other side, which is right there. And then we'll use our clear acrylic ruler, which it looks like it's chopping off 1 inch, and we will strike a line down there so we can cut off the excess.
Next up, we're going to cut the decorative fabric to size.
Okay, anywhere that you've sewn, it typically will shrink up the fabric a little bit, that's why this dips in a little bit. But we need to strike a line across here. We have some extra fabric, so I'm going to strike a line at a pattern that I can follow as a reference and straighten this edge, and then we'll measure for the opposite edge and cut it to size. Our cut size for us is 90 inches. We'll cut off the excess here, and then we'll measure to the other side and strike a line there and cut it to our 90-inch desired size for us.
Now we'll join the batting, lining, and decorative fabric together and pin them in place.
We are taking our Dacron and laying it flat on our table. You can do this on the floor as well. And it doesn't matter which side is up or down for this, it's going to be on the inside. Then we're going to take our lining and place it on top with the right side facing up. Okay, I've laid the lining fabric on top of the Dacron, and the lining fabric has the right side up, which means that the seam is on the underside in this middle spot, and I put the seam right on top of the Dacron seam. And we want to lay it nice and flat on a table, making sure there's no wrinkles. So now we'll take our decorative and place it on top of our lining material with the right side facing down, and it's already been cut to size. These are oversized. Now if you like, before you do anything, you can iron these so that they rest down. This is probably not crucial, but sometimes it can help the seam to lay flat. And you could always serge these edges or hot knife these edges. We just cut them. Now we need to make sure that we smooth it all out and there are no wrinkles in it, and we can move it once we get it pinned in position. So once everything's smooth, we're going to pin all three of these layers together. Now we're going to pin all the layers together. So I'm going to go through all three and then come out like that, and we will probably place one of these about every 8 to 12 inches all around the perimeter, securing everything in place. We also centered the decorative fabric with the seam that we have on the lining and the batting, so that that seam will be centered. We've pinned it from here to here. We still have to pin down the sides of the table, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to actually just pull it down here to the other end, put it on the table, and then I'll pin that side in the same manner. We'll be sewing around this entire perimeter, and we need to leave an opening because this is basically like a pillowcase that we're going to turn right side out. And that opening, I'm just going to leave approximately 20 inches. And there's no right or wrong place to do it, but I just want to mark the fabric with some chalk so I remember that I need to leave an opening. That way I'll sew all around the perimeter, and I'll stop at these locations so I can pull it right side out. Okay, the two sides are part-way pinned. We're going to pull it over so we get it on the top of the tabletop so we can pin around the edge out over there. And then we're going to make sure it's laying smooth before we pin around that perimeter. You can also use the multi-use pins around the perimeter. So now that we have it pinned, we're going to cut the excess off right along the decorative fabric, which is already cut to size, all around the perimeter.
Now we can sew that assembly together around the perimeter, as we discussed earlier.
So here's our middle position that we're not going to sew, or our line that we made earlier to help us remember. And there's the other line. So I'm going to start sewing here and sewing around the perimeter. I'm going to put in on a 1/2 inch guide here, 1/2 inch from the needle. We're going to put the needle in center position, and we're still going to sew about a 3 millimeter stitch length somewhere around there. Now I'm going to do a little bit of reversing here, because this may come under some tension when we turn it right side out. And we will sew around the perimeter here. Now if I have a little bit of fabric hanging over the edge, that's fine. I'm going to try to follow the decorative fabric and keep that up against the magnetic guide. Doesn't have to be perfectly accurate, just close. We can sew right through our pins. We want to lay this seam flat. I'm going to use a screwdriver to make sure it gets under that presser foot. When I get to the corner, what I'll do is I will sew about a 1/2 inch to the corner, bury the needle, lift the presser foot, and then carefully roll so I don't get poked with a pin this around so I can sew down the opposite side. Now I can lower my foot. Don't forget to do that, otherwise you'll have sewing problems. And sew this direction. When we get to seams like this, you just want to splay them flat. And sometimes what I do is I use a screwdriver just to make sure it gets underneath the presser foot. There we go. Here's our mark that we need to stop at. And we will do some reversing there. You're done.
Next, we'll turn the assembly right side out and close the end opening.
So now we'll just remove all the pins around the perimeter because we got to turn it right side out. Through the opening, we will open it up so that we see the lining fabric, and we're going to stick our hand inside and turn it right side out. So I'm going to go all the way to the top here and just pull it through. And once we get it all the way through, we'll show you what it looks like when we lay it out flat. At the corners, you can either stick your hand on the inside and push them out like that, or sometimes you can even grab the outside and just kind of work the corners until the corners are worked out. So now all we have to do is close up this opening. So we're going to take this and we're going to fold the lining fabric with the Dacron back about a 1/2 inch to equal our seam allowance. Then we'll take our decorative fabric and fold it back about the 1/2 inch. And temporarily right now, just because I'm not sure I'm happy with what it is, I'm going to use a Wonder Clip and I'm going to clip it together in the middle position to hold that. And then we'll continue to work it until we're really happy with how it's looking. Clipping it in place and making modifications as necessary. Yeah, see, I don't have, oh yeah, there's my seam allowance. Need to pull that down a little bit. Yeah, there we go. After we get it all clipped in place, I'll show you what it looks like. But you can play with this, so don't think that you can just clip it and all of a sudden be done. You need to make sure that it looks good before you take it to the machine and sew. So we're pretty happy with this. Looks good on the top side, looks good on the bottom. So we're only going to sew the area that needs to be shut, and we're going to sew that stitch really close to this edge to make it almost invisible. Okay, this is where we stop sewing, and you do need to sew through the white on the bottom side. So make sure your stitch is inside that. We're going to sew a little bit of forward and a little bit of reverse. As you come upon the Wonder Clips, just take them off. So here's the stitch, and there's what it looks like on the bottom side. Closes up that opening.
To prevent the batting from moving around in the center, we're going to tack it in place. It can also be quilted.
I measured the length and the width of our comforter from edge to edge, and then divided by a figure that would give me something around 15, 12 inches apart. And then so I came up with 16 inches and 17 3/4, and I made a template out of cardboard. And then all I'm doing is basically moving the cardboard from corner to corner and marking the fabric at the corner just by going down the sides of the cardboard like that. And this will indicate where I'm going to tack the 3 layers of fabric together. So I'm going to do this over the entire perimeter of the project using this template. We have all those locations marked with our template. Now we want to make sure that the fabric is nice and flat and that the edges are where they should fall. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take a pin very close to where we're going to sew, and we want to secure each one of these locations like that so that they don't move. So we're going to do that for every location, making sure that everything is nice and flat and edges are lined up. It's not a bad idea to pin both vertically and horizontally at each one of the locations to make sure that nothing moves after you're assured that everything's flat. We're going to put the machine in a zigzag stitch, full zigzag, and we're going to reduce the stitch length to almost neutral, which we're going to hope is right about there. If not, we'll reset it again. I've got some scrap with the lining on the bottom, then the Dacron, and then the decorative fabric. And we're going to sew a little sample here to make sure that our tension's right. And we're moving too much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lower this lever a little bit to almost neutral. I want it to move a little bit. I don't want it to be totally stationary. That's still too much. Try it there. That might be good, but I'm going to move this just so I can look at it again. So it's almost on top of itself, and I'm basically making a little square. That's what it looks like on the bottom side. I'm going to go tighter because I'd rather have that stitch be almost directly on top of itself. Let's see if that's better. Our stitch tension actually looks pretty good. That's one of the reasons I do it on some test fabric first. That looks good there. Oh yeah, that looks pretty good. That's what I'm going for. So I'm going to do a stitch like this at every one of those locations that we pinned onto our fabric. I got a little loop here. There we go. So here's our first location. We're going to get to that chalk mark. And what I like to do is just make sure that it stays where it's at by holding down and pulling the pins out, because those pins are going to get in the way. Make sure it's nice and flat. Put it on our mark, lower the foot, and we will sew a little bit in forward. Then we're going to do some reversing, right? Basically in that same pass, just a couple reverses. Sew a little bit and then do some reversing. Okay, and then we'll move on to the next one. I'm not even going to cut my threads. Make sure everything's nice and flat. You feel no wrinkles. Hold the location, pull the pins. We'll sew in forward. Then reverse a little bit, a couple times in reverse. Then sew a little bit, and then reverse. So now we'll just trim all the threads on the back side and the top side so that they're nice and flush. Okay, we used black thread on the top side and the bottom side mainly because of the fact that if you don't, sometimes you see the white thread of the bottom side come through the top, and we didn't want that at all. So there we are.
The comforter is now complete. Coming up next is a materials and tools list that we used to make this comforter. You'll find hundreds, if not thousands, of decor fabrics that'll work great for a comforter like this. If you have any questions about the materials or tools, give us a call at Sailrite. We're glad to help. If you enjoyed this video, click the link in the description below or at the icon at the top right to check out other projects in the Airstream Argosy renovation series. I'm Eric Grant, and from all of us here at Sailrite, thanks for watching.